Picture this. It is a spring evening, 14,700 years ago. You are standing at the edge of a wide grassland that reaches all the way to the horizon. The air smells of wet earth and warming heather. Somewhere far off, the low, rumbling call of a mammoth herd moves across the plain like distant thunder, and behind you a fire burns, warm on your back, safe. For nearly 2,000 years now, the world has been growing kinder. The great ice sheets have been retreating. Rivers are running full again. Herds have returned to lands that were, until very recently, only cold and silence. Every generation, life has become a little easier. Every generation, the world has felt a little more like home. Most of us, when we imagine that long climb out of the Ice Age, imagine it as a steady line, a slow warming, all the way through to the world we know today. Except, that is not what happened, because on a night much like this one, 12,800 years ago, the entire Northern Hemisphere cooled by nearly 15 degrees, a shift so sudden that within a single human lifetime, one ordinary life, the warm world these people had built everything around simply stopped. Nobody who was alive to feel it knew why. And here is the thing, nearly 13,000 years later, we are still not entirely sure. Tonight, we are going to walk gently through that lost 1,000 years. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Wherever you are right now, I am glad you found this. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, whether you are in London at midnight, Chicago at 2 in the morning, or Melbourne just before dawn. You are not listening alone. And a quiet word before we begin. If your eyes grow heavy at any point tonight, let them close. You do not need to follow every word. Just let the sound of this story carry you. Tonight, we will move through 5 stops in a story that lasted more than 1,000 years. First, we will stand in the warm world, the great grasslands and river valleys, the enormous creatures that walked alongside early people, and the careful lives being built before history had a name. Then we will feel the turn, the cold that arrived not over centuries, but over years. From there, we follow the clues through ancient ice, buried sediment, and 4 quiet suspects that scientists still argue about today. Then, we will spend time with one family in the highlands of the Levant, learning what it means to hold on when the world goes still. And finally, we will watch the warmth return, slowly, patiently, like a tide coming back in. Woven through all of it is something that may be sitting on your table tonight. Something ordinary, something very old. So settle in, get comfortable, pull the blanket a little closer, because we are going back 12,800 years to a world stranger than you expect, and more familiar than you can imagine. But before we feel the weight of what was lost, we need to understand the world that came first. The warm, breathing, extraordinary world these people called home. The world you are standing in, on that spring evening 14,700 years ago, is brand new in the way that matters most. Not the planet itself. The planet is old beyond any number that carries meaning, but the feeling of it, the warmth, the fullness. The sense that the earth around you is busy with something it has not been busy with for a very long time. Less than 2,000 years ago, this same ground you are standing on was buried under ice. Not thin ice. Not the kind that forms on a river in winter and breaks up by spring. This was ice more than a mile thick in places, a weight so crushing that it pressed the bedrock itself down into the mantle, compressing the crust of the earth beneath it like a slow, geological exhale held for thousands of years. The land you are standing on has only recently been freed from that weight. It is still, in a very real sense, recovering, rising almost imperceptibly with each passing century, lifting itself back toward its original height, something scientists would eventually call isostatic rebound. The ground beneath your feet is, literally, exhaling, but none of that is visible to you tonight. What you can see and smell and hear is a world that is alive. Here is the thing about the warming that made this world possible. It arrived faster than most people imagine. 14,700 years ago, Temperatures across the Northern Hemisphere rose by between 5 and 7 degrees Celsius in just a few decades. Not over millennia, not over centuries, decades. Within a single human lifetime, within the span of one ordinary person watching the seasons turn, the climate of an entire hemisphere shifted. To put that in terms that carry their full weight, that is roughly the same temperature difference as the difference between the climate of London and the climate of Marrakesh today. A shift that large, in the space of one lifetime. A child born into a cold, spare world of tundra and scraped stone could grow old inside a functioning grassland, breathing air that smelled of warming heather and river mud and life. This extraordinary warming had a name, the Bowling Allerode Interstadial, a label that sounds cold and technical and does no justice whatsoever to what it actually meant, which was something like mercy, something like the world deciding, after a very long silence, to begin again. The ice sheets retreated. The Great Laurentide Ice Sheet, which at its maximum extent had covered most of North America and stretched south past the latitude of what would one day become Chicago, began to pull back toward the pole. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet, which had buried Scandinavia and northern Germany beneath kilometers of ice and pushed glacial outwash plains across what is now the North Sea, began to carve at its edges and dissolve into the warming ocean, and as the ice pulled back, it left behind something that had not existed there before. Land. Raw, scraped, startlingly bare land. Meltwater ran everywhere. It filled the valleys in torrents, carving new river channels through freshly exposed earth, carrying fine glacial silt, and depositing it in broad, flat deltas. New lakes appeared in the low-ground cold, clear basins scraped out by the weight of the ice now filling slowly with sky water and snowmelt. The soil the glaciers had ground to powder over thousands of years lay open to the wind, and the wind carried seeds, and the seeds began, one by one, to find purchase. Grasses came first, as they almost always do, wind-pollinated, opportunistic, content to root in the barest mineral soil. Sedge and cotton grass pushed into the newly bared ground along the ice margin, thin and sparse at first, then thickening as the organic layer accumulated, season by season, stem by fallen stem. Behind the grasses came heather and willow scrub in the sheltered hollows. Behind the willows came birch pale-barked, quick-growing, the great pioneer tree of the northern world, spreading outward from sheltered valleys and pushing north with each decade of sustained warmth. And behind the birch, in the more temperate regions further south, oak and elm and hazel began their own slow migration northward, following the warming front in a vegetative procession that would, over the coming millennia, reshape entire landscapes. Here is the thing. This was not a single event with a clear beginning and end. It was a process uneven, pulse-like, advancing in the warm years and retreating slightly in the colder ones, always feeling along the edges of what the climate would allow. But across the span of a few centuries, the direction was unmistakable. A living world was assembling itself from scratch, piece by piece, species by species, root by careful root. And into this assembling world came the animals. They had survived the worst of the cold in refugia, scattered pockets of more sheltered, more southerly ground where populations had held on through the glacial maximum, reduced but not extinguished. Now those populations expanded. Reindeer moved north along the corridors opened by the retreating ice. Bison spread across the new grasslands in herds whose tracks would have marked the morning ground like a kind of living scripture. Aurochs, the great wild cattle that stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder and would eventually become, through thousands of years of careful selection, every breed of domestic cow alive today, grazed along the river margins in numbers that are difficult to imagine now. Fish crowded the newly formed rivers. Waterfowl colonized the shallow wetlands by the hundreds of thousands, their calls filling the early mornings with a sound that has no equivalent in the quieter, emptier world we have inherited. Abundance. After a very long time of not abundance, this world was simply strikingly full. For the people who moved through it, this fullness was something genuinely new, or new enough that it changed everything. For generations, human life in the high latitudes had been shaped by the logic of scarcity, by the long distances between reliable food sources, by winters that lasted past endurance, by the need to keep moving, always moving, staying one step ahead of the hunger that followed a failed hunt or a year when the herd changed its route. Not everywhere on Earth, and not in every season, but as a structural fact of existence in the glaciated North, life had been lean. Now, in the Burling Alla Road, it was not. Water was close. Game was near and predictable. In the highlands of the Levant, that ancient arc of fertile land curving from what is now southern Turkey through Syria and Lebanon and down into the Jordan Valley, something remarkable was already beginning. Wild grasses grew so densely in certain places that a family could harvest enough grain in a few good weeks to eat for months. Springs ran year-round, hillsides held game, and the people who had been following those resources from season to season began, in some places, to slow their following, to linger, to build. Not cities, not yet, not even villages in the sense we might recognize, but structures with intention, shelters set on stone foundations, designed to last past one season, hearths dug into the earth and lined with flat stones, meant to hold fire through many winters, storage pits carved into the bedrock for grain and dried meat, carefully sealed. A place in the northern Jordan Valley, which archaeologists would one day call Ain Malaha or Ainan, was already sheltering dozens of people by this period, living not as a passing band, but as a community with a centre of gravity, a place to return to, a place where the dead were laid in the earth with objects placed beside them, a stone blade, an ochre-dusted shell, as if someone believed there was a journey ahead that would require tools. That is grief. The particular kind of grief that only exists when you have a place to come back to, and someone is no longer there. You can feel it in the evening air, standing at the edge of the grassland. The warmth is not only meteorological, it is the warmth of a fire kept burning because someone will be awake to tend it. It is the warmth of voices in the dark, inside a structure built to outlast the people who built it. It is the quiet, accumulating warmth of a world that is, for the first time in a long time, generous enough to allow people to stay. The world is at its kindest, and it is not alone in that kindness. Because out there in the long evening shadows of the grassland, something else is moving. Something large. Something that will turn out to be one of the most important presences in this entire story. The warm world did not belong only to the grasses and the rivers and the careful human settlements gathering in the river valleys. It belonged, in equal measure, to the giants. Picture this. The sun is low, and the grassland is lit in that particular evening gold that makes everything look as if it is glowing from inside. You are watching the plain from a slight rise, a gentle fold in the ground above the river, and something is moving out there. Not one something, many. A herd of woolly mammoths is crossing the valley below you. There are perhaps 30 of them, moving in a loose, unhurried column, the large females at the flanks, several young ones close to their mothers, the biggest animals walking with a slow, swaying deliberateness that makes the ground feel present in a way it does not when they are gone. Their coats are dense and rust brown in the evening light, their curved tusks catching the last of the sun. The nearest one is perhaps 200 meters away, and even at that distance you can hear the low, resonant rumble of its breathing, a sound that is less heard than felt, somewhere below your ribs. A woolly mammoth stood roughly 3.5 meters at the shoulder, and weighed somewhere between 4 and 6 metric tons. To put that in terms that mean something, a fully grown mammoth weighed approximately the same as a large delivery truck. Its tusks, which could reach 3.5 meters in length in old males, were not weapons in any simple sense. They were tools. They were used to sweep snow from grazing ground in winter, to strip bark from trees, to dig through permafrost for the roots and tubers beneath. An old mammoth's tusks were curved and worn in ways that told the entire story of its life, which side it favoured, what it had eaten, what obstacles it had pushed against across decades of living. They were extraordinary animals, and in the warm world of the Burling Alarud, there were a great many of them. But here is the thing, and this is something that took scientists a long time to fully appreciate. The mammoths were not merely living inside this landscape, they were helping to create it. A grassland this productive, this stable, this richly layered with species, does not simply happen on its own, it is made. And the making requires, among other things, very large animals doing very large things. Mammoths and other megafauna acted as what ecologists now call ecosystem engineers, organisms whose presence and movement and behavior shape the physical environment for everything else that lives in it. When a mammoth herd pushed through a stand of young trees, it created clearings where grasses could grow, where smaller animals could graze, where the soil was turned and aerated by the pressure of heavy feet. When a mammoth died, as all things die, its remains fed scavengers, and its decomposing body released nutrients back into the soil in a concentrated pulse, a kind of slow, biological generosity that nourished the earth for years. The pathways that mammoth herds travelled, followed season after season across generations, became the drainage channels and game trails and, eventually, the river courses that shaped the whole topography of a region. The grassland was not a backdrop to the megafauna. The grassland and the megafauna were making each other, and the mammoths were not alone in this work. The Burling Alarud world of the Northern Hemisphere was shared with a community of large animals that, from our current vantage point, looks almost impossible. Woolly rhinoceroses moved across the Eurasian steppe, armoured and purposeful, cropping the grassland with heavy lips and turning the soil with their horns. Cave lions larger than any lion alive today, and adapted to open ground rather than forest hunted in ambush along the river margins, their presence shaping where the herbivores grazed and where they chose to drink. Cave hyenas ranged across Europe and Asia in family groups, following the great herds and cleaning the kills that the lions left behind. And then there was the giant deer. The megaloceros, the Irish elk, though it ranged far beyond Ireland and was not strictly an elk, was perhaps the most visually astonishing creature of its time. A fully grown male stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder and carried antlers with a total span of nearly 4 meters wider than most rooms you have ever stood in, wider than you could reach with both arms extended. Those antlers could weigh 45 kilograms on their own, and the animal that carried them was built accordingly. A neck and shoulder musculature of extraordinary power, a body evolved over thousands of generations specifically to bear the weight of beauty. The megaloceros was not a rare creature. It lived in herds, grazed widely, and left its bones across a range stretching from Ireland to Siberia. It was a commonplace feature of the landscape, as unremarkable to the people who shared its world as cattle are to us. Think about that for a moment. To the people standing on the rise above the valley 14,000 years ago, the sight of a megaloceros moving through the evening grass would have been ordinary, a feature of the world, simply present. We have one painting of an Irish elk. It was found on the wall of a cave in France, rendered in ochre by someone who had clearly seen this animal many times and knew exactly how it held its head when it walked. The painting is confident. The lines do not hesitate. This was not a mythological creature to the person who painted it. It was something they knew. That painter lived and died and is now 14,000 years gone, along with everything they loved and feared and wondered about. The elk they painted is gone too. Its bones lie in bogs across the breadth of Europe and Asia, collected, catalogued, studied. Its antlers hang in museums, still faintly astonishing, still requiring a second look. But that evening, that specific evening with the golden light and the mammoths crossing the valley and the smell of wet earth and warming heather that evening was real. It happened, and the world that it happened inside was as complete and intricate and alive as any world that has ever existed on this planet. Somewhere out there in the grassland, perhaps a kilometer from where you are standing, a small group of people are moving. They are following the herd. They are carrying tools. They know this land in the way that only comes from living inside it for generations, the way the ground holds water near the old riverbed, the way the herd always pauses at the bend before the crossing, the way the wind shifts in the late afternoon, and what that means for tomorrow. They are not primitive. They are not simple. They are fully human in every sense that matters, walking through a world that is, right now, at the very peak of everything it will ever be. And one day, not yet, but one day, not so very far off in the long accounting of time, the mammoths will fall silent, the megaloceros will disappear from the hillsides, the woolly rhinoceros will be gone, and the cave lion, and dozens of other creatures that were, in this moment, simply part of the world. But we are not there yet. Right now, the world is full, the evening is warm, the fire is burning behind you, and the people moving through the grassland ahead are still, for a little while longer, at home in a world that does not yet know what is coming. To understand what was lost, you have to first understand what was there, and what was there was a life built with extraordinary care inside an extraordinary world. In this warm and generous world, two very different groups of people were building lives with extraordinary care in two places that could not have been farther apart. One was following the herds across a wide, wind-combed plain. The other was tending a hearth beside a spring that had never, in living memory, run anything but full. Picture this. It is midday on a wide, wind-combed plain in what will one day be called North America. The grass here grows waist-high and pale gold, and the air smells of dust and the first hint of distant rain. A group of hunters, perhaps a dozen people, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who know exactly where they are going, is following a trail of broken stems and flattened earth. Ahead of them, though they cannot yet see it, a young mammoth has fallen behind its herd. These people carry a particular kind of stone tool, one so distinctive that it will one day give an entire culture its name. The blade is long, leaf-shaped, flaked with a technique so precise that a single fluted groove runs nearly the length of the point, struck from the base in one controlled motion. It takes years of practiced hands to make a point like this. One wrong strike, one moment of inattention, and the whole piece shatters into fragments. These are not crude implements, hastily shaped and quickly discarded. They are the product of patient skill, carried across a continent, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. Points like this one have been found scattered across an almost unbelievable range, from the plains of what will become Montana, down through Texas and Mexico, all the way to the tip of South America. The same careful fluting technique, the same patient hand, repeated across a distance greater than the width of the Atlantic Ocean. Whatever knowledge these people carried, it travelled with them, generation after generation, faster and farther than almost anything else in the human world at this time. We call these people the Clovis. It is not the name they called themselves, that name is gone, along with almost everything else about the particular texture of their days, their jokes, their private fears, the sound of their voices in the evening. But the tools remain, and the tools tell us something important. These were not people scraping by at the edge of existence. These were people who had mastered a very particular kind of hunting, in a very particular kind of world, with a precision that still draws quiet admiration from the people who study it today. Here's the thing about the Clovis hunters: they were not chasing mammoths out of desperation. They were doing it because, in this crowded and generous world, it simply worked. A single mammoth could feed a group this size for weeks. Its hide, once cured and worked soft, could shelter a family through an entire winter. Its bones could become tools, needles, even the framework of a dwelling. To bring down one great animal was to secure, in a single long afternoon, what might otherwise take a full season of smaller hunts to gather one meal at a time. The hunters closed the distance slowly, moving with the wind rather than against it, reading the mammoth's tired gait the way you might read a friend's mood from the set of their shoulders. There is no shouting here, no chaos, just patience, and the low murmur of hand signals passed from one hunter to the next. When the moment finally comes, it comes quietly, a coordinated approach along a narrow game trail, spears set, breath held. By nightfall, the herd has moved on, and the work of carrying the animal home has already begun. For the rest of that day and the days that follow, the real work continues. The careful work of preparing meat for the winter to come, the drying over slow fires, the careful scraping of the hide, the splitting of long bones for marrow, and for the tools that will be made from their splinters. Nothing here is wasted. Nothing here is casual. This is a people who have learned, over uncountable generations, exactly how to make a warm world provide. Now picture somewhere else entirely. Not a plain, but a hillside one that curves gently down toward a spring-fed valley in a stretch of land that will one day be called the Levant. The air here smells different, warmer, drier, threaded through with wild wheat and barley, growing so thickly along the slope that it moves like a shallow sea whenever the wind passes over it. At the base of that hillside, beside the spring, there is a settlement, not a camp that will be abandoned within the season, a place with roots. Circular stone foundations mark where round houses once stood, their walls built low and solid, their floors dug slightly below ground level to hold in warmth through the cooler nights. Hearths, lined carefully with flat stones, sit at the centre of each home, blackened from years not days of steady use, and beneath the floors, sealed into pits carved from the bedrock, is grain, stored, guarded, meant to last. Archaeologists would one day call this place Ein Malahar Einen in the older tongue, and what they would eventually find there surprised almost everyone who studied it, because this was not supposed to exist yet. People were not supposed to be building homes meant to last, burying their dead with care and small offerings, storing surplus grain in sealed pits, this early. The story, as it had always been told, was simple. First hunting and gathering, then, much later, farming and villages. One tidy line. Here's the thing, the people at Ein Malahar were living something far messier and far more interesting than a tidy line. They were staying in one place while still gathering wild food rather than growing it. They were building homes meant to outlast a single season, in a world that, for the moment, made that possible. Wild grain grew so abundantly on the surrounding slopes that a family could gather in a few good weeks, enough to store through an entire year. Springs ran reliably. Gazelle moved along familiar, predictable paths. The world had made staying possible. And so, cautiously, people had begun to stay. Inside one of these houses, in the hour before dusk, a woman kneels beside the hearth, feeding it slivers of dry brush one at a time, watching the flame catch and settle. Her hands know this fire the way your hands know the light switch by your bed without needing to look. Nearby, someone is grinding grain between two flat stones, a slow, rhythmic sound that has probably been the background hum of this house for years. A child sleeps against the wall, wrapped in something soft. Outside, the light is turning the colour of warm honey and the smell of the valley wild grain. Wood smoke, the mineral coolness of the spring drifts in through the low doorway. There is no urgency in this room, only the quiet, accumulated rhythm of a life that has, for the first time in a very long while, been allowed to stay in one place long enough to become familiar. We call these people the Natufians, and among them, inside one of these low stone houses, beside one of these carefully tended hearths, is a family we will return to before this story is finished. A family who does not yet know that the very world which has made their settled life possible is, in this quiet moment, approaching its final years. They do not know this, of course. Nobody standing inside a world at its warmest ever imagines that world ending. The Clovis hunters, tracking a mammoth across the grassland on the far side of the world, do not know it either, nor do the families gathered around hearths from the Jordan Valley to the plains of what will one day be called Texas, all of them living, each in their own way, inside the same long, uninterrupted season of plenty. The world in this moment is generous almost everywhere you look. Wild grain on the hillsides, herds on the open plains, rivers running full of fish. A climate that has, for nearly 2,000 years, only ever moved in one direction, toward warmth, toward abundance, toward more. 2,000 years is, on its own terms, an enormous stretch of time, far longer than any single family, any single settlement, any single memory could span. To everyone alive in this moment, warmth is not a phase. Warmth is simply how the world is, and always has been, and surely always will be. There is no elder in either community who remembers anything different. There is no story passed down of a colder, harder time, because for as long as anyone's grandparents' grandparents can recall, the world has only ever been opening up, season after season, a little wider than before, and that quiet assumption that a good direction will simply continue, that tomorrow will resemble today, only slightly kinder, is exactly the assumption this story is about to take apart. That assumption did not survive what came next. Because on a night not so different from the ones these families had come to trust, the world turned. Everyone alive in this warm world believed, in the quiet way that people believe things they have never had reason to question, that the direction of things was settled. Warmer springs, fuller rivers, herds that kept expanding into land the ice had only recently surrendered. 2,000 years of gradual, gentle improvement had taught an entire hemisphere of people, without a single one of them ever framing it this way, that the world simply got kinder as time went on, except it did not. Here's the thing about the ending of the warm world. It did not arrive the way endings are supposed to arrive. There was no long, visible decline, no decade of people noticing the winters growing a little harder, the summers a little shorter, and bracing themselves for what was coming. The world these people knew simply continued, apparently unshaken, right up until the moment it stopped continuing at all. 12,800 years ago, somewhere in the North Atlantic, something shifted. Scientists who would spend the next century trying to understand exactly what happened would eventually agree on this much. Within a span of time that may have been as short as 1 decade, possibly less average temperatures across the Northern Hemisphere fell by an amount that is, even now, difficult to say out loud without pausing. Nearly 15 degrees Celsius. Not over 1,000 years, not over a century. Within the working lifetime of a single adult. To put that number in terms your body already understands, imagine the climate outside your window right now, and imagine it becoming, within the space of a single decade, something closer to the depths of a polar winter, and staying that way. Not for one bad season, for roughly 1,200 years. Scientists gave this long cold snap a name, borrowed from a small pale wildflower the mountain avens, or Dryas octopetala, whose pollen turns up again and again in lake sediments from exactly this period, a quiet botanical fingerprint left behind in layers of mud that have sat undisturbed for millennia. They called it the Younger Dryas, a gentle name, almost pretty, for what was, by any honest measure, one of the most abrupt climate shifts in the last 100,000 years of Earth's history. Picture the far north, in the years after the turn. The great ice sheets, which had been retreating steadily for 2,000 years, stopped retreating. In some places, they began, faintly, to advance again, glaciers creeping forward over ground they had only just surrendered, as if the planet itself had changed its mind. Sea ice spread further south than it had in centuries, choking harbours and coastlines that had grown used to open water. In the mountains of Europe, glaciers that had shrunk to modest remnants swelled back toward their old, Ice Age proportions within a span of time too short for anyone to have predicted. The grasslands that had taken 2,000 patient years to assemble themselves, the wildflowers, the deep-rooted grasses, the willow scrub and the pioneering birch did not have 1,200 years to adapt. Many of them simply could not survive what came next. Rivers that had run full and clear began to freeze earlier and thaw later, until some of them, in the harshest years, barely thawed at all. The wild grain on the hillsides of the Levant, which had grown so densely that a family could gather a year's food in a few good weeks, thinned, failed, returned in places to something closer to what it had been before the warming began. And the people living inside all of this, the Clovis hunters following their herds, the Natufian families tending their hearths and their sealed grain pits, did not know why. They could not have known why. There was no way, from inside a single human lifetime, to see the mechanism behind a shift this large. All they could feel was what anyone would feel, that the world they had trusted, the world their grandparents had trusted, the world that had only ever moved in one direction, had turned, quickly, without warning, without explanation. It is worth pausing on that word "turned" for a moment, because it is doing more work than it might seem. This was not a gradual dimming, like a long autumn settling slowly into winter. From what the evidence shows us, the shift arrived with what almost feels, across this distance of time, like intention. One set of conditions, sustained and trusted for 2,000 years, replaced within a single decade by another, colder, harsher set entirely, as if some vast, unseen switch had simply been thrown. Here's the thing that makes this moment so strange to look back on. Nearly 13,000 years later, we still do not fully agree on why it happened either. That is not a small admission. Scientists have spent decades studying ice cores, ocean sediments, cave formations, and fossilized pollen, assembling an extraordinarily detailed record of exactly how fast and how far the cold descended, and yet the deeper question, the question of what actually triggered it, remains genuinely, honestly open. Several serious explanations exist. None of them, on their own, fully closes the case. We will spend some time with each of them shortly, not because any single one holds the full answer, but because the search itself is one of the more quietly fascinating detective stories in all of Earth's recent history. For now, sit with the shape of what happened. A world at the peak of its own generosity, cooling by 15 degrees inside the span of one decade, grasslands that took 2,000 years to build, unraveling in a fraction of that time. People who had only ever known abundance, suddenly having to relearn, in real time, the older and harder skills of a colder world, skills their own grandparents might have practiced once, but had long since set aside. This is not a story about villains. There is no antagonist here, no single cause we can point to and say, simply, there. It is something quieter, and in its own way more unsettling than that. A reminder that even the longest, most convincing trends can end without asking permission first. That the world does not owe anyone a straight line, but it is also, if you sit with it a little longer, strangely comforting. Because the people in this story, the hunters, the families by the hearth, the community gathered at Ain Malaha, did not vanish when the world turned. They adapted. Slowly, imperfectly, sometimes at great cost, but they adapted. Their descendants are, in a very direct sense, still here, still living. Still, in ways we will come to before this story ends, shaping the world you are lying in right now. There is one more thread worth holding on to here, quietly, before we move on. The great herds that had filled these grasslands, the mammoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, the giant deer with antlers wider than a doorway, were built for a world of abundance. Built for deep snow they could sweep aside with their tusks, for grass that grew tall and reliable across a predictable season. A world that turns cold this quickly, this unevenly, does not simply inconvenience animals like these. It tests them in ways that will take several more centuries to fully reveal. We are not there yet, but it is worth remembering as the frost sets in over the grassland that the giants are standing in it too. For the people themselves, adaptation looked like small, unglamorous decisions made over and over, season after season. Storage pits dug a little deeper to protect grain from a frost that now arrived earlier than expected. Hunting ranges widened because the herds no longer followed quite the same paths they once had. Hearths built up higher, banked more carefully at night. None of this is the stuff of dramatic legend. It is the stuff of ordinary human resilience, the same quiet, adaptive intelligence that has carried people through every hard turn this planet has ever handed them. Long before written history began keeping score, and at Ain Malaha, in the house we visited earlier, the family beside the hearth begins, without quite realizing it yet, to make those same small adjustments. A little more grain set aside, a little more care taken with the fire at night. They do not know what is coming, not in any detail, not with any certainty, but something in the rhythm of the seasons has begun, subtly, to feel unfamiliar, and the body tends to notice unfamiliar things long before the mind finds the words for them. So let's follow the evidence, not the myths, not the assumptions, the evidence itself, preserved in places you would never expect to find a record of the past, locked inside ancient ice, buried in seafloor mud, written into the rings of long-dead trees. That evidence is waiting for us, layer by patient layer, in a place colder and quieter than almost anywhere else on Earth. If you want to know what really happened to the world 12,800 years ago, you cannot ask the people who lived through it. Their voices are gone, along with their languages, their names, nearly everything about them, except the tools they left behind and the bones of the animals they ate. But the Earth itself, it turns out, kept its own record, quietly, patiently, in places almost nobody thought to look until surprisingly recently. The most remarkable of these records sits beneath nearly 2 miles of solid ice, at the centre of Greenland. Picture a research station up there, a cluster of low buildings on an endless white plain, the wind constant, the silence enormous in a way that is hard to describe unless you have stood inside it. Scientists here spend months drilling a narrow column straight down through the ice sheet, extracting a cylinder of frozen water only a few inches wide, but, in places, more than 2 miles long. Each layer in that cylinder is a year, sometimes a season, snow that fell, compressed, and never left, going back not centuries, but tens of thousands of years. Here's the thing about ice like this. It does not just record temperature, it records air, tiny bubbles trapped inside the ice, sealed the moment the snow above them compacted, hold actual samples of the atmosphere from the exact year that layer formed. When researchers melt a section of an ice core in a sealed chamber and release those bubbles, they are not estimating what the ancient air was like. They are breathing, in a sense, the same air a Natufian child might have breathed, preserved for 13,000 years in a bubble smaller than a grain of rice. And what those bubbles show, right at the layer marking 12,800 years ago, is striking. Atmospheric methane, a gas closely tied to the health of the world's wetlands, its swamps, its marshes, dropped by roughly a third within just a few decades. Wetlands across the Northern Hemisphere were drying out or freezing over on a scale large enough to leave a fingerprint in the sky itself. A fingerprint still readable underneath 2 miles of Greenland ice, nearly 13,000 years later. The ice holds a second kind of clue, one written not in bubbles but in the water itself. Water is not all identical at the atomic level. Some molecules carry a very slightly heavier form of oxygen than others, and the ratio between heavy and light oxygen in a snowflake depends, in a measurable and consistent way, on how cold the air was when that snowflake formed. Layer by layer, scientists can read this ratio like a thermometer, reaching back through time, and at the layer marking the turn, the ratio drops sharply, exactly matching the abrupt, decade-scale cooling that the rest of the evidence already suggested. Ice that fell during a warm decade looks chemically different from ice that fell during a cold one, and the boundary between the two, in Greenland, is almost shockingly narrow, a handful of layers, a handful of years, separating one climate from another entirely. Here's the thing that makes this evidence so quietly extraordinary. This is not a story reconstructed from guesswork or inference stacked on inference. This is closer to a direct reading of the past, imperfect, incomplete in places, but astonishingly precise where it does speak. Ice cores from Greenland agree with ice cores from Antarctica. 1. They agree with sediment cores pulled from the bottom of European lakes, where fine, undisturbed layers of mud have been settling for over 10,000 years, one thin band at a time. They agree with the growth rings of ancient trees preserved in bogs, where a series of unusually narrow, stressed rings marks a decade when the growing season simply refused to lengthen the way it should have. Multiple archives, different corners of the planet, different scientists, working decades apart, with different instruments never coordinating with one another, all of them converging, independently, on the same narrow window of time and the same startling speed of change. Lakes in Germany and Switzerland hold this same signature in a slightly different form. Their sediments are laminated thin, alternating bands of light and dark material deposited season after season, summer after summer, winter after winter, for thousands of unbroken years. Counting these bands is not unlike counting tree rings, except the tree in this case is an entire lake basin, and at the layer corresponding to 12,800 years ago, the banding changes character abruptly coarser, colder, consistent with lake ice that formed earlier and lingered longer than it had in the centuries before. That kind of agreement is rare in any science, and it is part of why the Younger Dryas is considered one of the best documented abrupt climate shifts in Earth's entire history, even though, as we touched on a moment ago, the deeper question of what triggered it remains genuinely open. There is a third archive worth knowing about, quieter than the other two but just as telling. Buried within those same ice layers are trace amounts of a rare form of beryllium, called beryllium 10, created when cosmic rays from deep space strike the upper atmosphere. The amount that reaches the ground and settles into snow depends on the strength of the Earth's magnetic field and the behavior of ocean and wind currents that circulate the atmosphere, which means that, layer by layer, beryllium 10 offers scientists an entirely independent way of checking the timeline, built from physics that has nothing to do with oxygen ratios or trapped gas bubbles. And when researchers line up the beryllium record against the oxygen record and the methane record, the three of them settle into agreement, each confirming the others, like three separate witnesses to the same event, each describing it in their own language. Here's the thing worth remembering about all of this evidence, before we go any further. None of it was easy to find. The ice core that first revealed the sharpness of this transition was not drilled until the 1990s. Before that, scientists studying the Younger Dryas relied mainly on pollen counts from lake mud, which suggested a large shift but could not resolve it in anything sharper than centuries. It took the ice patient, layered, 2 miles deep to show the world that this change had actually happened inside a single human generation. The story got faster and stranger the closer people looked. Before we go further, let's just sit with this for a moment. 2 miles of ice, a bubble of 13,000-year-old air, a ratio of oxygen atoms that remembers a temperature nobody alive today has ever felt. It is a strange kind of intimacy, being able to reach back this far and touch something this precise. You do not need to hold on to the numbers. Just let the shape of it settle. The evidence is there, it is patient, and it is remarkably consistent. It helps, maybe, to think of it this way. Somewhere in a quiet laboratory, a scientist sits with a core sample no wider than a broomstick, laid out in careful sections on a clean table, each section labelled and dated with a precision that took a full career to earn. They are not looking for a story. They are looking for a signal, a small, consistent deviation in a ratio, a subtle darkening in a band of sediment, a trace element measured in parts per trillion. And yet, laid end to end, these small signals add up to something that feels, unmistakably, like a story. A warm world, a sudden turn, a long cold aftermath that would last more than 1,000 years before the warmth found its way back. So if the evidence agrees on what happened and roughly when, the question that remains, the one that has occupied climate scientists for the better part of half a century, is simpler to state than it is to answer. What could possibly cause an entire hemisphere to cool this much, this fast? There are 4 serious suspects, and, like any good piece of detective work, each one is compelling, each one has real evidence behind it, and not one of them, on its own, has fully closed the case. 4 suspects, 4 competing explanations for the same sudden cold. It's time to meet them, one at a time. 4 suspects, 4 competing explanations for the same sudden cold. Not one dramatic answer waiting at the end, but a careful investigation conducted the way any patient investigation should be. One line of evidence at a time, without rushing toward a tidy conclusion that the evidence itself has never quite offered. There is no dramatic reveal waiting for you at the end of this, only degrees of confidence, and a case that, nearly 13,000 years later, is still, in an honest sense, open. The first suspect is water. Not the ocean rising, the ocean's plumbing failing. Here's the thing about the North Atlantic that most people never have reason to learn. It runs on something close to a conveyor belt. Warm water travels north near the surface, all the way up from the tropics, carrying heat that it slowly releases into the air above places that would one day be called Ireland and Norway, which is precisely why those coastlines stay far milder than their latitude alone would ever explain. As that warm water gives up its heat, it cools, grows saltier and denser, and eventually sinks thousands of meters down, beginning a long, quiet return journey south along the ocean floor, only to warm again and rise again somewhere near the equator, and start the whole slow circuit over. Scientists would eventually name this system the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. You do not need to hold on to that name, just hold on to what it does. It is the ocean's great heating system, and for a very long time it had simply been running, quietly, in the background of everyone's life. Now, picture something enormous sitting just west of the retreating ice sheet, in what is now central Canada, a lake larger than all 5 of today's Great Lakes combined, held in place by nothing more permanent than a wall of its own parent ice. Glacial Lake Agassiz, as it would eventually be named, had been filling for centuries, fed by meltwater pouring off the shrinking Laurentide ice sheet, growing wider and deeper with each passing decade, pressing against an ice dam that could not, by its very nature, hold forever. And then, in a moment, geologists can now trace through layered sediment scattered across river valleys, stretching from the prairies toward the Atlantic coast. That dam gave way. Picture it, gently, without drama, a vast body of cold, fresh water finding, at last, a way through and around the ice that had contained it, spreading outward across the land in the patient, relentless way that water always moves when it is finally allowed to. Not a single violent instant, but a widening flood, carving new channels, filling old ones, eventually reaching the North Atlantic in a volume that is difficult to hold in the mind, pouring fresh water into exactly the place where the ocean's great conveyor depends on saltiness to sink and keep the whole system turning. Fresh water, here's the thing, is lighter than salt water. It does not sink the way the conveyor needs it to sink. And when enough of it arrives quickly enough, in the right place, it can do something that sounds almost too simple for the size of what follows. It can slow the conveyor, stall it. In the more dramatic readings of the evidence, shut it down almost entirely for a time. Turn off the ocean's heating system, and the coastlines it has been quietly warming lose that warmth within years, not centuries. The cold that follows would not creep in gradually, the way a season usually turns. It would arrive close to overnight, exactly the way the ice, the lake mud, and the ancient tree rings all say that it did. That is suspect 1. Compelling, well supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. And still, honestly, not fully closed, because matching the precise timing of the flood to the precise timing of the cooling has proven far harder, even with every modern tool available, than anyone studying this expected it to be. The second suspect arrived from somewhere far stranger than a lake. It arrived, if the evidence is read at its boldest, from the sky itself. scattered across more than 50 sites throughout North America, sealed inside a thin, dark layer of ancient sediment that researchers simply call the black mat, lie traces that do not resemble an ordinary winter, elevated levels of iridium, an element vanishingly rare at Earth's surface, but common in the kind of material that falls from beyond it. Microscopic diamonds, the sort that form only under extraordinary heat and pressure, tiny glass-like spherules, the kind produced when material is instantly melted and flung skyward before cooling, mid-flight, into droplets no larger than grains of sand. To some researchers, this is the fingerprint of a comet, or a scattered swarm of comet fragments, striking or detonating above the ice sheet around 12,800 years ago, flinging enormous volumes of fine debris into the upper atmosphere and dimming the sun just enough, for just long enough, to tip an entire hemisphere toward cold. It is a striking idea, and it gained an unexpected piece of supporting drama when researchers scanning Greenland with ice-penetrating radar identified a genuinely enormous crater more than 30 kilometers across hidden beneath the Hiawatha. Glacier, exactly the kind of scar an impact this size might leave behind. Here is the thing, though, and it matters more than a satisfying ending would. When scientists eventually dated the bedrock beneath that crater directly, the number that came back was not 12,800 years, it was closer to 58 million, a genuinely remarkable discovery in its own right, an ancient scar hidden for tens of millions of years beneath the ice, but very likely the wrong wound at the wrong moment for this particular mystery. Most of the wider scientific community remains unconvinced by the impact hypothesis in its strongest form, not dismissive of it entirely, simply waiting, the way careful people wait, for evidence that has not yet arrived cleanly enough to settle things one way or the other. So the second suspect stays on the list, quietly, without much certainty behind it. Not because the case against it is strong, because the case for it has never quite closed either. Two suspects then. One carrying real weight of evidence, one carrying far less, but not nothing. And two more waiting patiently in the next room, for us to come and ask them what they were doing on the night the world turned cold. There are two more suspects still waiting to be questioned, one born from fire deep in the earth, one written in changes far above it, in the sun itself. The third suspect sits in the Eifel region of what is now Western Germany, in a place that today looks almost impossibly peaceful. A round, still lake, ringed by gentle hills and quiet forest, the kind of place postcards are made from, Leiche Sea. Few visitors walking its shoreline today know they are standing on the rim of a volcano, one that, close to this same window of time, erupted with a force that dwarfs almost anything Europe has witnessed since. Here's the thing about a large volcanic eruption. Its danger to climate has very little to do with lava, and almost everything to do with what it throws upward, invisibly, into the sky. The Leiche Sea eruption sent enormous volumes of sulfur high into the stratosphere, well above the weather, where it combined with moisture to form a fine haze of sulfate aerosols, tiny reflective particles that can drift for months or years, quietly bouncing a portion of incoming sunlight back into space before it ever reaches the ground. Enough of that haze, spread widely enough, and an entire hemisphere can cool measurably within a single year, even without a single glacier moving an inch. Ash and sediment from Leiche Sea have been found layered into lake beds and peat bogs across a surprising stretch of Europe, and their timing, when carefully dated, sits close enough to the onset of the Younger Dryas that many researchers consider it, at the very least, an accomplice even if not the one acting alone. The fourth suspect is quieter still, and further away than any of the others, the sun. You will remember, from the ice itself, a rare form of beryllium, 1-0 that forms when cosmic rays from deep space collide with the upper atmosphere and drift slowly down into the snow. How much of it reaches the ground depends partly on the strength of the sun's own activity, because a more active sun produces a stronger solar wind, and a stronger solar wind helps shield the Earth from some of that incoming cosmic bombardment. Layer by layer, right around the turn to the Younger Dryas, the beryllium 1-0 record shows a shift consistent with a quieter sun, fewer solar particles pushing back against the cosmic rays, more of them reaching the atmosphere, more of the tracer accumulating in the ice. It is a subtle signal, and on its own, most researchers agree it is far too small to explain 15 degrees of cooling by itself. But subtle is not the same as irrelevant. A quieter sun, arriving at the same fragile moment as everything else on this list, is exactly the kind of detail a careful investigator does not simply dismiss. So, 4 suspects. A meltwater flood, powerful enough to stall the ocean's great heating system. A possible impact, its physical evidence real, but its central piece of proof, the crater itself, dated to entirely the wrong era. A volcano in what is now quiet, forested Germany, filling the stratosphere with reflective haze at close to the right moment, and a sun that may have, however slightly, turned down its own output at precisely the wrong time to help hold the warmth together. Here's the thing that the evidence keeps insisting on, however much a tidy story might prefer otherwise. No single one of these 4, on its own, comfortably explains both the size and the speed of what happened. The meltwater flood is the strongest single suspect, but even its most convinced researchers acknowledge that the timing is not perfectly resolved. The volcano may have added its own weight to a system already leaning toward collapse. The quieter sun may have removed one more small buffer, right when every buffer mattered. What increasingly seems most honest to say, and what a great many climate scientists now lean toward, is that this was not the work of one culprit acting alone, but a chain of coincidence. Several separate, ordinarily survivable disruptions, each modest on its own, arriving within the same narrow window of time, compounding on top of one another, until a climate system already balanced on a knife edge simply could not absorb any more. Not a single dramatic cause, a convergence. That is, in its own way, a stranger and more unsettling answer than any single villain would have been. It means the world did not need one enormous catastrophe to turn this cold, this quickly. It only needed several smaller ones to happen at almost the same time, and it means the deeper mystery whether such a convergence could happen again, and what would need to align for it to happen remains, honestly, still open. We do not know for certain. Scientists studying this today would tell you exactly that. Without embarrassment, the case is not closed. It may never fully close. But here is a question worth sitting with, quietly, before we move on. If the cold could arrive this suddenly, propelled by a chain of small, unlucky coincidences rather than one visible cause, does the warmth, when it finally does return, arrive the same way, suddenly without warning? Or does it take the long, patient road back? That question will follow us gently for the rest of this story, the way a low hum follows a held note after the music has technically stopped. For now, we leave the laboratories, and the ice cores, and the careful, patient scientists bent over their instruments, because on a hillside in the Levant, a real family is about to feel this turn far more directly than any chart ever could. As you lie here, perhaps starting to drift, that is perfectly fine. You do not need to hold on to anything I've told you so far, not the ice cores, not the 4 suspects, not a single number. Let all of that go quietly now, and let me take you somewhere smaller, somewhere quieter. Back to the Hearth we visited earlier, in the hills above a spring that is beginning, ever so slowly, to change. Picture this. The air inside the house smells of dust and dry grass, and underneath that, faintly, of wood smoke that has soaked so deeply into the stone walls over the years that it no longer needs a fire burning to be present. It is simply part of the house now, the way the smell of an old book is part of the book. Outside, the light is the pale gold of very early morning, and the spring below the settlement, the one that has never, in living memory, run anything but full, is quieter than it used to be. Not silent, just quieter, a softer trickle where there used to be a steady, confident rush. You can hear it, if you listen. The grinding stone, first a slow, patient rhythm, stone against stone, as a woman kneels near the hearth, turning what grain remains from last season into something closer to flour. The sound is unhurried, almost meditative, though her hands, if you looked closely, are moving a little more carefully than they used to, counting, without quite admitting to herself that she is counting. Her hands are rough at the knuckles, warm despite the cool morning air, and they know this particular stone the way your own hands know the shape of a favourite mug in the dark. Nearby, a small fire holds steady in the hearth banked low, tended with a kind of quiet economy that was not always necessary here. Wood is a little harder to find this season, everyone has noticed, though almost no one has said it aloud. A child sleeps against the far wall, wrapped in something soft and worn thin from years of use, breathing slow and even, undisturbed by any of this. And that, more than anything else in the room, is the point. The adults have quietly agreed, without ever discussing it directly, that whatever is changing outside this house will not be allowed to touch the child's sleep. Not yet. Maybe not for a long while, if they can help it. Here's the thing about this particular kind of hardship. It did not arrive all at once, the way the cold itself arrived across the wider world. It arrived slowly, the way a season overstays itself. A little less rain than expected, 1 year. A little less again the next. Grain that used to grow thick and easy along the hillside now growing thinner, sparser, requiring longer hours of gathering for the same amount of food. The spring's usual generous flow, thinning almost imperceptibly, month over month, until someone finally noticed that the water level against the old marker stone had dropped by a hand's width. Then too, great scarcity, when it comes like this, rarely announces itself. It simply asks for a little more patience than the year before, and then a little more than that. The man of this household sits near the doorway, running his fingers slowly over a small collection of grain kept separate from the rest. Not for eating, for planting, if the ground allows it this year. He turns each seed over once, twice, the way you might turn over a decision you are not ready to make yet. He does not speak. There is nothing urgent enough yet to require speaking, just the quiet, careful attention of someone doing the small, unglamorous work of holding a household together, one patient decision at a time. It will hold, the woman says softly, without looking up from the grinding stone, not entirely to him, not entirely to herself either. Just a small sentence, offered into the room, the way you might offer a hand to steady something wobbling. And it does hold. For now, there is no fear in this room. Not yet. Only a kind of attentiveness, a household quietly adjusting, the way people have always quietly adjusted, long before anyone wrote any of it down. The fire stays lit. The grain, however thin, is measured out with care rather than worry. The child sleeps on, undisturbed, wrapped in warmth that someone worked hard, in small and mostly invisible ways, to make sure would still be there. You do not need to worry for them tonight. Whatever is coming, they will meet it the way people always have, slowly, together, one small decision at a time. Let your own breathing settle into the rhythm of that grinding stone. If it helps, slow, steady, unhurried. There is nowhere else you need to be right now except exactly here, in this quiet room, with this small fire, and these two people who do not yet know how their story ends, but who are, in this moment, simply doing what needs to be done, what this family chooses to do next, not in a single dramatic moment, but across many small, patient seasons will quietly change the shape of human life forever. Here's the thing about the choice this family is about to make. It will not feel, from the inside, like a choice at all. It will feel like the only sensible thing left to do, the kind of decision that arrives not in a single moment of clarity, but through 100 small, unremarkable Tuesdays, each one nudging the household a little further down a path nobody set out to walk. The spring is thinner this year than last, and last year it was thinner than the year before that. The wild grain on the hillside, the grain that once grew so densely a family could gather a season's food in a few good weeks, has grown thinner too. Its stands more scattered, its yield less certain with every passing season, and so a question, quiet and practical, begins to take shape around every hearth in this settlement. If the land itself is asking for more than it used to give, what does staying actually require? For the man and woman we met beside the hearth, the answer arrives the way most important answers arrive in a life like theirs, not as an idea, but as a habit. It starts with the small handful of grain the man keeps separate from the rest, turning each seed over between his fingers, choosing them not because they are the largest or the fullest, though often they are, but because something about them, a resilience, a stubbornness, a way of surviving a dry spring that other seeds did not survive, makes them worth keeping. He does not have a word for what he is doing. There is no word yet for what he is doing, but he is doing it anyway, has been doing it for several seasons now, almost without noticing that it has become a practice rather than an impulse. Picture this. It is early morning, and the ground beside the spring ground that has never been anything but wild, unclaimed, indifferent to any single family's needs has been turned, not by accident, by hand, by a patient, repeated pressure of a wooden digging stick worked into soil that has, for as long as anyone remembers, simply grown whatever it grew, wherever it happened to grow. Now there are shallow furrows here, straightish, deliberate, and into each one the woman is pressing seed by careful seed, covering it with a light pass of soil, moving down the row with the same unhurried rhythm you might recognize from her hands at the grinding stone patient, practiced, certain of what they are doing, even when the outcome is not certain at all. This is not farming, not yet, not in any way a later era would recognize it. It is something quieter and more tentative than that. A wager. A small repeated wager that if you give a piece of ground your attention, your seed, your water carried by hand from the thinning spring, your protection from the animals that would otherwise eat what you have planted before it has any chance to grow, the ground will, eventually, give something back. It is not a certainty. It is closer to a promise extended in one direction, offered without any guarantee that it will be returned. Here's the thing about a promise like that. Once you have made it, once you have knelt in the dirt and pressed seed into soil you intend to return to, you have also made a second, quieter promise to stay. You cannot plant a field and then wander 3 valleys away for the season. You cannot tend a furrow and also follow a herd wherever it chooses to go. The wild grain on the hillside asked nothing of anyone. It grew or it did not grow, indifferent to whether you were there to see it. This new arrangement asks for something different. It asks for a kind of loyalty to a place, to a patch of ground, to a return date fixed by the seasons rather than by the movement of animals or the whims of weather. That is the survival pact, if it needs a name. Not a contract between people, but something stranger and older, an unspoken agreement between a family and a piece of land, in which each side offers something the other cannot survive without. The family offers attention, water, protection, patience. The land offers, if the pact holds, something it has never quite offered before: predictability. Not abundance. This is a harder world than the one their grandparents knew, but a kind of abundance you can plan around, rather than one you can only hope to stumble into. It will take generations for this small tentative wager to become anything resembling what a later world will call agriculture. Right now, in this exact season beside this exact spring, it is simply 2 people making a series of small, careful decisions, most of which will never be recorded, none of which feel, to the people making them, like the beginning of anything larger than getting through this particular year. And yet, something in the rhythm of this morning hand's pressing seed into turned earth, water carried carefully from a spring that gives a little less each season, a field marked out and returned to, day after day, through a hardship that has not ended and will not end for a long while yet. Something in this quiet, repeated act will still be recognizable, in its shape if nothing else, in kitchens and gardens and fields you have never seen, held by hands connected to these hands by a thread longer than either of them could imagine. Not a straight line, not a single invention with a single inventor, just this, a family choosing to stay, choosing to tend, choosing one small furrow at a time to make a promise to a piece of ground that has not yet decided whether it will keep its half of the bargain. Word of what this family is doing does not stay confined to their own doorway for long. Ain Malaha is not so large a place that anyone's habits go entirely unnoticed, and there is, this season, a particular kind of attention paid to the household that seems to be managing, seed by counted seed, a little better than most. Not through luck, through method, a neighbour asks, carefully, almost shyly, whether the woman might spare a small handful of this year's kept seed for planting of her own. She does. Not because she has enough to spare without noticing she does not, but because something about the shape of scarcity in this new, harder world seems to call for the opposite of hoarding. A pact made with the land, it turns out, works best when it is not made alone. By the third or fourth season, several households along this stretch of hillside are doing some version of the same thing, saving seed, turning ground, returning to the same patches of earth. None of them would call it a system yet. It feels, if anything, like a shared stubbornness, a community's collective refusal to be undone by a spring that gives less water than it used to. And that, quietly, is the shape of what comes next. Not a single harvest, not a single triumphant season of plenty. A pact, extended household by household, along one hillside, in one difficult stretch of centuries, the first careful draft of a relationship between people and the ground beneath them, that a much later world would build entire civilizations upon, without ever fully remembering how tentative, how uncertain, how many quiet mornings by a thinning spring it actually took to begin. What this hillside was learning to do quietly, with seed and soil, a very different kind of monument was about to do with stone gathering people together for reasons that had nothing to do with food at all. The family beside the thinning spring does not live to see where this story is going. Neither do their children, most likely, nor perhaps even their grandchildren, but something in the direction they chose stay, tend, return, share the seed rather than hoard. It turns out to be a direction an entire region is leaning toward, hillside by hillside, generation by careful generation, and roughly 1,000 years after the coldest years of the Younger Dryas begin to ease, that direction arrives somewhere extraordinary. Picture this: a hilltop in what will one day be called southeastern Turkey, bare and windswept, offering a view that stretches for miles in every direction. The kind of place you climb to see something, or to be seen from somewhere far away. People are gathering here, not a handful, not one family, groups drawn from settlements scattered across a wide surrounding landscape, arriving with purpose, carrying tools, carrying food, carrying, though no one alive at the time could have described it this way, something like a shared idea. They are raising stone, not small stones, enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing more than 5 meters tall, each one weighing many tons, quarried from bedrock some distance away and dragged, hauled, levered into place by human effort alone, with no draft animals yet domesticated to help carry the load. The pillars are arranged in wide circles, several of them, each ring enclosing a space clearly meant for people to gather inside, and carved into many of the pillars with a patience and skill that still surprises the archaeologists who study them today are animals. Foxes, boars, vultures with wings spread wide, scorpions and snakes rendered in careful, confident relief, as if whoever carved them had watched these creatures for a lifetime and wanted the stone to remember exactly how they moved. Archaeologists would eventually give this hilltop a name, Gobekli Tepe, and what they would find here, once they began to carefully uncover it, upended a story that had been told confidently for the better part of a century. Here's the thing that makes this hilltop so quietly astonishing. These pillars are roughly 11,500 years old. To put that in terms that carry their proper weight, this hilltop is older than the pyramids of Egypt by more than 6,000 years. Older than Stonehenge by nearly 7,000. When the pyramids were new, Gobekli Tepe was already something ancient, half-buried, and already, in its own way, forgotten. For a long time, the standard telling of this whole era assumed that monuments like this one large, coordinated, requiring the sustained labour of many hands working toward a shared purpose, could only exist after farming had already settled people into villages, given them surplus food, and freed enough hands from the daily work of survival to build something purely for meaning rather than for shelter or storage. Farming first, the story went. Then, much later, the temples and the gathering places and the shared belief. Gobekli Tepe suggests something closer to the opposite, or at least something far messier than a tidy sequence. The people who raised these pillars were not yet full-time farmers. They were still gathering wild grain on nearby hillsides, not so differently from the family we spent time with earlier, still hunting the animals whose likenesses they were carving into stone. And yet here they were, coordinating labour on a scale that would have required organising dozens, perhaps hundreds of people across multiple communities, not for food, not for shelter, but for something that looks unmistakably like shared belief, like the deliberate act of gathering together around ideas too large for any single hearth to hold. We do not know, and likely never will know with any real certainty, exactly what these gatherings meant to the people who built them. We do not know what stories were told inside these stone rings, what songs were sung, what ancient beliefs about the animals carved into the pillars, or about the sky above this hilltop, or about whatever it was that drew people back here again and again across generations. That uncertainty is not a failure of the evidence. It is simply the honest shape of a very old silence. What we can say, with real confidence, is that this was a place people chose to return to, a place that mattered enough to justify enormous, sustained, cooperative effort, long before anyone had a permanent village to call home. And somewhere in the long chain of generations between the family beside the thinning spring and the hands that raised these pillars, something quietly completed itself. A single household's stubborn, patient pact with a small furrow of ground had, by this point, grown into something far larger. A whole landscape of communities capable of trusting one another enough to build together, to gather together, to carve their shared attention into stone that would outlast every one of them by more than 11,000 years. The family did not fail. They could not have known it, but in the most quiet and unglamorous way, they succeeded completely, and what they built, one careful season at a time, eventually grew large enough to raise a monument. It is worth pausing, just for a moment, on how strange and quietly moving this progression actually is. A family kneeling beside a thinning spring, uncertain whether their small wager with a furrow of ground would ever pay off. Neighbouring households joining that same wager, season by season, because scarcity made solitary hoarding feel like the wrong kind of strength. And now, generations later, so many of those same hillside communities that entire groups of strangers, people who had never met, who spoke in accents unfamiliar to one another, who came from valleys separated by days of walking, found enough shared trust, enough shared purpose, to raise stone circles on a hilltop that offered them nothing practical in return. No shelter, no grain, only gathering. And whatever meaning that gathering held, that is what survival, extended far enough across generations, can eventually become. Not merely staying alive, but building something together that outlasts any single life, any single hardship, any single hearth. The family we met beside the spring never saw this hilltop. They likely never imagined anything like it. But the patient, communal instinct they practiced in miniature share the seed, trust the neighbour, return to the same ground together rather than scatter alone is, in its own quiet way, exactly the instinct that made a hilltop like this one possible at all. There is something worth sitting with, quietly, in the fact that we know so much about how these pillars were carved, and so little about why. The stone remembers the animals. It remembers the effort, the scale, the patient skill of people working with tools far simpler than anything you have ever held. But it does not remember, in any language we can read, what any of it meant to the people who built it. Perhaps that mystery is not something to resolve, so much as something to simply hold a reminder that meaning does not always leave evidence behind, even when the effort that meaning inspired leaves stone that lasts 11,000 years. Gobekli Tepe would eventually be abandoned, buried gradually, deliberately. Some researchers now believe under mounds of earth and rubble, the great stone rings filled in and left to sleep beneath a bare hillside for millennia. Undisturbed, unremembered, until a farmer's plough struck something hard in the 20th century, and an entirely new chapter of this story quietly began. But that is a different story, for a different night. Tonight, it is enough to know that it was here, that people built it, that whatever brought them back to this hilltop, again and again, mattered enough to move stones no single person could ever have moved alone. The great stone rings on that hilltop were not the end of this era's story, because far off, across the same widening grasslands where the mammoths once walked, something far larger than any monument was beginning, very quietly, to fall silent. Picture this, one more time, on that same wide grassland where we began this story, though the season by now has changed in ways that would astonish anyone who saw the plain at its height. Where a herd of 30 mammoths once moved through the evening light, the grass is thinner now, patchier, broken up by shrub and scrub that would never have survived on ground so thoroughly, so constantly grazed by animals that no longer come this way in the numbers they once did. Here's the thing about an ending like this one. It very rarely arrives as a single dramatic event. There is no last mammoth standing alone on a hillside, aware that it is the last of anything. There is only, over the span of centuries rather than a single season, a slow and largely invisible thinning. Fewer calves born each spring than the year before, fewer herds crossing familiar routes, until one year, in some particular valley, the tracks simply stop appearing, and no one at the time has any way of knowing that they have stopped appearing for good. By the time the worst of the Younger Dryas cold finally begins to ease, and we will come to that easing shortly, something remarkable and quietly sorrowful has already happened across the Northern Hemisphere. Roughly 35 genera of large animals, most of them creatures that had shaped these grasslands for tens of thousands of years, have reached the end of their journey. The woolly mammoth, the giant deer with antlers wider than a doorway that we watched cross a golden evening plain earlier in this story, the woolly rhinoceros, the cave lion, creature after creature, family after family, quietly gone from a world that had, for so long, simply assumed they would always be part of it. It would be easy, looking back from this distance, to reach for a single tidy explanation, a single culprit, the way the earlier chapters of this story searched for a single cause behind the cold itself. But the honest answer here is, once again, a chain of coincidence rather than a lone villain. The changing climate mattered enormously. A world lurching between rapid warming and sudden, decade-scale cooling gave these grasslands no stable footing to recover on, no reliable season to plan around. Generation after generation, the shrinking and shifting of the grasslands themselves mattered too. The very ecosystems these animals had helped engineer, clearing ground, aerating soil, spreading seed, were becoming patchier, more fragmented, less able to support herds at the scale they once had, and the growing presence of human hunters across this same landscape, skilled, patient, increasingly widespread, added a pressure that these populations, already stretched thin by a changing world, may simply not have had room left to absorb. None of these three factors, most researchers now agree, would likely have finished the job alone. Together, compounding on top of one another across centuries already destabilized by the abrupt turn of the Younger Dryas. They proved to be more than these ancient herds could outlast. It is, in its own quiet way, the same shape of story we heard earlier about the cold itself. Not one dramatic cause, but several ordinary pressures arriving together at exactly the wrong time. What is lost when a creature like the woolly mammoth reaches the end of its journey is not only the animal itself, it is the particular, irreplaceable work that animal did in the world around it, the clearings it created by moving through brush, the soil it turned with every heavy step, the nutrients its presence returned to the ground season after season. Ecologists studying these grasslands today can trace, with real precision, how the landscape itself began to change once its great engineers were no longer there to shape it. Grasses that once thrived under constant, heavy grazing gave way, in many places, to shrub and scrub that a mammoth herd would once have kept in check. The open, productive steppe that had supported so much life for so long began, slowly, to close in on itself. There is a kind of grief worth allowing here. Even at this distance of 13,000 years, not a dramatic grief, not one that needs villains or blame, but the quieter kind that simply sits with a great loss and lets it be exactly that. These were not simple creatures. They were, each of them, the product of millions of years of careful evolutionary refinement, perfectly suited to a world that, through no fault of their own, stopped existing in the shape they needed it to hold. The last of the woolly mammoths on the world's mainland reached the end of their journey within a few thousand years of this period, their numbers thinning generation after generation, until the grasslands simply stopped holding herds large enough to sustain them. And yet here's the thing worth carrying forward, gently, as we move toward the end of this long, cold chapter loss. Like this rarely means silence in every direction. Grasslands become something else, not nothing. New species find new footing in the changed landscape. The people who once shared these plains with the great herds, the Clovis hunters we met earlier, following mammoth tracks across the grass in the warm years adapt, as people have always adapted, learning to live differently in a world with fewer giants in it. Nothing here is erased completely. It is transformed, the way almost everything in this long story has been transformed. Slowly, unevenly, and with a kind of continuity that outlasts any single loss, however great. Somewhere back in this story, we spent a moment with a painting an Irish elk, rendered confidently in ochre on a cave wall by someone who had clearly watched that animal many times and knew exactly how it held its head when it walked. That painter is long gone now, and so eventually is the elk. But the painting remains, patient and detailed, in a cave that has kept it safe for longer than most human civilizations have existed. It is a strange kind of comfort, if you let it be one. The elk itself reached the end of its journey, but something of how it moved through the world, the specific, particular truth of it survived anyway, carried forward by someone who simply wanted to remember it well. That is, in its own way, exactly what is happening across this whole vast grassland, on a scale too slow and too large for any single person to observe directly. Nothing is erased without a trace. The bones remain, waiting patiently in riverbanks and bogs for someone, thousands of years later, to notice them and wonder. The changed landscape remains, telling its own quiet story to anyone willing to read it. And the deep structural relationship between large animals and the grasslands they shaped, a relationship this story has spent real time with, from the very first evening on that golden plain, remains something ecologists still study today, in landscapes across the world, trying to understand exactly what is lost when the great engineers of a place fall silent. For now, on this hillside cooling into another long night, it is enough to hold this quietly. An entire world of giants lived here, shaped this ground with their own bodies, and reached, gradually and without any single dramatic moment, the end of their journey. What replaces them will be smaller, and in some ways gentler, but the people who remain adapting, as they always have, to whatever the land asks of them next are about to prove, in their own quiet way, exactly how much can survive a world that has changed this much, this fast. Picture this, one final time, before we let this chapter settle. The grass moves in a small wind, the same kind of wind that once carried the low rumble of mammoth herds and the calls of waterfowl across a wetland thick with fish and unhurried mornings. Now it carries mostly silence, not an empty silence, but the particular hush of a landscape recalibrating itself around a smaller cast of characters. Somewhere out of sight, smaller herds still move. Reindeer, bison, the quiet persistence of aurochs grazing along a river's edge. The world has not ended. It has simply quietly become something else. Not every ending in this story is a quiet one, though, because far to the north the ice that had spent 1,200 years advancing was about to do something nobody standing in the cold could have predicted. It was about to let go, almost as quickly as it had arrived. The ice would find its rhythm again, but before it did, before we stand in that particular turning and feel a hemisphere begin, very quietly, to warm again, there is one more small room in this story worth spending time in, a small camp, a quiet fire, and a group of people who never knew, in any generation of their lives, that the world was going to give them their warmth back. As you lie here, perhaps drifting in and out of this story now, that is exactly as it should be. You do not need to keep track of who is where, or when, or why. Just let the sound of this next quiet stretch carry you a little further into the night. Nothing important is going to be lost if you rest through it. The people in this camp will hold the fire for you. Picture this. It is late autumn, somewhere on the wide, wind-combed plains of what will one day be called North America, in one of the last generations of what we now call the Younger Dryas. The evening is cold enough that breath hangs visible in the air for a moment before softening away. A small group of hunters sits close around a low, careful fire, its coals banked with the same practiced patience their grandparents' once used to bank a fire that had far less reason to be economical. There are perhaps 8 of them here tonight. 2 older men, working quietly at the edges of a hide stretched between them. A younger woman and her sister, turning small strips of dried meat above the coals. A pair of teenagers still learning where to stand and when to speak, and how much silence is the right amount around a fire like this one. And an elder, a grandmother, by the way the others tilt slightly toward her when she moves, whose face carries a lifetime of weather in the way that faces do when they have watched, without ever needing to be told, exactly how much has changed inside a single life. The tools laid out around the fire are not quite the tools their great-grandparents carried. The long, fluted stone points that once travelled with the Clovis hunters across most of a continent, those beautiful, patient blades made for bringing down giants, have grown smaller in the generations since the world began to cool. The great herds those points were shaped for have thinned, and finally, in most of these hunting ranges, quietly stopped appearing at all. And so the hands that once carried tools built for mammoths now carry something a little quieter. Smaller points, made for smaller animals, worked with a slightly different rhythm to suit the smaller work. Here's the thing about that shift, though it did not feel from the inside like a loss. Not exactly. There was no single generation that gathered around a fire and said, "The giants are gone, we will have to become someone else now." That is not how any of this ever actually happens. What there was, instead, was a slow, steady accumulation of small practical decisions. A father teaching a son to work a slightly smaller flake because the deer they were hunting no longer needed the size. A grandmother showing a granddaughter which valley the caribou still passed through and which one they had stopped visiting 3 winters ago. A cousin returning from a season away with a way of hafting a point onto a shorter shaft, better suited to the closer, quicker work of ambush along a river's edge. Adaptation, at this scale, does not look like heroism. It looks like paying careful attention. It looks like small hands working on smaller tools in a world that has quietly given itself a different shape to work with. You can see it in the way the young woman by the fire is turning a piece of dried meat over the coals now. Not the dense, generous meat of a mammoth or a great steppe bison, but something leaner, from an animal small enough that 2 hunters could carry it back to camp between them without needing to butcher it in the field. There is enough. It has taken more days of walking, and more careful reading of tracks, and more shared knowledge across more households than a Clovis hunter of the warm world would ever have needed to gather this many meals. But there is enough. Every hearth in this camp is warm tonight, and every belly, and no one is going hungry into the cold. The elder is telling a story to the 2 teenagers now, in a low, even voice you have to lean toward to catch. It is a story about her own grandmother, and about an evening on a plain that no longer looks quite the same as it did then. The teenagers listen the way teenagers have always listened to stories from a great distance in time, partly present, partly somewhere else, but present enough to remember. Details will survive this evening, not all of them, but enough. That is, in the end, how most of the important things travel between generations, not through careful writing, not through anything anyone would call a record, but through a low voice around a fire, held long enough to reach the next set of ears. Here's the other thing worth holding on to tonight, quietly, as the fire settles. These people did not know that the warmth was coming back. There was no elder in this camp, no story in any camp that promised the cold would end. As far as anyone alive in this generation knew, the cold was simply how the world was, the world they had inherited, the world their children would inherit, the world their grandchildren in turn would learn to keep a small fire alive inside of. They were not waiting for anything. They were simply living carefully inside what they had been given, and that is, in its own way, the quiet marvel of this whole long stretch of time. Not that they endured on the promise of a better tomorrow, but that they endured without any promise at all, that they kept the fires lit, kept the smaller tools sharp, kept the stories moving from one generation to the next, kept their children fed and their elders warm, through more than 1,000 years of a world that had, from every angle they could see it from, simply stopped getting kinder. Somewhere far to the north of this camp, though far beyond anywhere these hunters have ever travelled, far beyond anywhere their grandparents ever travelled, either the great ocean's heating system has been quietly, patiently doing something no one alive in this generation can feel yet. The water is finding its old rhythm again. The salt is sinking. In places it had stopped sinking. The conveyor, silent for so long, is beginning, faintly, to turn. They do not know this. They cannot know this. It will be centuries yet before any of it reaches this particular plain, and their great-great-grandchildren will be the ones who first notice, faintly, that a spring lasted a little longer than it used to, and that the grass came in a little thicker along the river, and that perhaps this year, for the first time in anyone's memory, the fire could be banked a little lower at night, because the cold seemed a little less certain than it had been the year before. For now, the fire holds. The story continues. The younger sister passes a piece of warmed meat to the elder, who accepts it without breaking her sentence. The teenagers listen. The 2 older men finish their work on the hide and lay it carefully aside, ready for tomorrow, and the night settles gently around a small, careful camp full of people who have never, in their entire lives, been anything other than exactly here, and who have, without ever quite noticing they were doing it, held an entire cold world together with the small, patient work of ordinary hands. What none of them can feel yet but what has already begun, somewhere far out at sea, in the slow return of a current that had been quiet for far too long, is that the warmth is, at last, on its way home. It happens more quickly than anyone could have predicted. That, in the end, is the strangest and most quietly astonishing thing about the ending of the Younger Dryas. Because if you had asked any of the questions this story has been asking, how did the cold arrive so fast? What held it in place for 1,200 years? Would it ever end at all? The natural expectation, the reasonable expectation, would be that the warmth, when it finally returned, would take a very long time indeed to find its way back. that a hemisphere pushed into cold by a chain of coincidence would need centuries, maybe a full millennium, to gently work its way back to abundance. That is not what happened. Roughly 11,700 years ago. The exact year is still debated, but the shape of it is not the great ocean conveyor found its rhythm again. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, in a process that took perhaps only a few decades, warm surface water began sinking properly again, the way it always used to. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, that quiet, enormous system whose slowing had helped tip the world toward cold in the first place, settled back into something close to its old, patient, life-giving pattern, and with it, warmth began, once more, to reach coastlines that had been cold for longer than any living memory. Here's the thing about that return. It arrived at almost the same startling speed as the cold once had. Ice cores from Greenland show, once again, an abrupt shift in the oxygen ratios that mark ancient temperatures, this time in the other direction. In some measurements, temperatures across parts of the Northern Hemisphere rose by roughly 10 degrees Celsius within a matter of decades, roughly the same scale as the original cooling, reversed, and just as sudden. Nobody, standing on any hillside or plain during those years, would have understood what was happening. There was no way, from inside a single generation, to see that they were living through the mirror image of an event their ancestors had lived through more than 1,000 years earlier. What they would have felt instead was much smaller and much more human, a spring that lasted a little longer than usual, a river running fuller than the one their parents had described, a hillside where the wild grain came in a little thicker, then thicker still, and almost too thick to gather all of it before the birds arrived. The pattern that had held for over 1,000 years, the pattern of every year being, in some quiet way, a little harder than the year before, began subtly to reverse. And this time, the direction was toward kindness. That is the quiet answer to the question that has been following us for a while now, like a low hum beneath everything else. Yes, the cold did end. Yes, it ended almost as quickly as it had arrived. And no, nobody living through it understood what was happening, any more than the people at the start of the Younger Dryas had understood the cold's arrival. The world simply, once again, turned. Only this time it turned the other way. There is something worth sitting with, gently, in the shape of that turning. The same climate system that could tip so suddenly into cold could also, apparently, tip just as suddenly back out of it. Not because anyone had done anything to earn it. Not because the world had learned some kind of lesson. Simply because the tangled, delicate arrangement of ocean currents and atmospheric patterns and heat budgets that keeps a hemisphere habitable had, at last, found its own way back to something close to its former balance. Whatever chain of coincidences had knocked it out of that balance 1,200 years earlier, some other, quieter chain of coincidences was now, patiently, easing it back. The great ice sheets, which had paused their retreat and in some places begun to advance again during the long cold, resumed their slow melt. Meltwater began to run freely once more, but this time without the enormous single flood that may have helped trigger the original cooling, just steady, gradual, seasonal streams, feeding rivers that ran a little fuller each spring than the one before. Sea ice pulled back from coastlines that had been locked in winter for centuries. Trees crept north again, following the warmth the way they had followed it once before, in a movement so slow no single person could see it, but so relentless that within a few centuries, entire landscapes had quietly rewritten themselves. For the small camps and quiet families still living inside what had been the long cold, the hunters we sat with earlier, and their cousins cousins scattered across half a hemisphere. None of this arrived as revelation. It arrived as small mercies, one on top of another, across generations, the kind of mercies you barely notice until you look back, decades later, and realize you have not, in a long while, needed to bank the fire quite so carefully at night. That is how a long turning ends, more often than not with a moment, with a gradual, unmistakable easing, felt first by the people who paid the closest attention, and only later understood by everyone else. The cold had come like an event. The warmth returned like a season that simply refused, quietly, to stop arriving. And out of that returning warmth, over the long centuries that followed, an entirely new chapter of this planet's story began to open, the calm, forgiving stretch of time we are all still living inside of tonight. If your eyes are getting heavy, let them close. You do not need to remember any of this. Just let the sound of this story be your companion tonight. There is nothing coming that you need to be awake for. There is a name in the geological record for the long, steady, remarkably calm chapter of Earth's history that followed the ending of the Younger Dryas. Scientists call it the Holocene, a word borrowed from ancient Greek that simply means the entirely new, and it is the epoch, quiet and mostly forgiving, that we are all still living inside of today. The Holocene did not arrive with fanfare. There was no morning on which anyone, anywhere, woke up and realized that a new age had begun. The warmth returned in the way we have been describing, gradually, unevenly, generation by generation, and only much, much later, when scientists sitting patiently over ice cores and lake sediments began to notice a genuine, sustained stability in the climate record, did anyone give a name to what they were looking at? A stability that had, by then, been holding for thousands of years. A stability that, on the long geological scale, is genuinely unusual. Here's the thing about the Holocene that is worth simply holding, without needing to remember any details around it. For the roughly 11,700 years since the last great cold snap eased, the climate of the Northern Hemisphere has been remarkably, almost improbably, calm. There have been wobbles, small warm periods, small cool ones, the kinds of gentle oscillations that shape the specific character of one century versus another, but nothing like the Younger Dryas. Nothing like a 15-degree drop inside a decade. Nothing like a 1,000-year winter descending without warning on a world that had grown used to gentleness. That extraordinary stability is the ground on which almost everything we recognize as human civilization was quietly built. Reliable seasons, rivers that ran full at predictable times of year, rainfall you could plan a harvest around, the kinds of environmental promises that a family beside a thinning spring 12,000 years ago could never have made to their grandchildren, but that their grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, generation after patient generation, gradually came to take for granted. You do not need to keep track of the timeline. It is enough to know this: the small, careful pact that a household in the Levant made with a furrow of ground during the coldest years of the Younger Dryas, a pact you spent time with earlier tonight, was not a curiosity. It was the beginning of something. It was the earliest, most tentative version of a relationship between people and the land beneath them that, once the Holocene arrived and settled and held, spread outward, hillside by hillside, valley by valley, across most of the habitable earth. Villages grew, in places where villages had once been impossible. Fields widened. Hearths that had held families through the cold began to hold families through the long, comparatively easy centuries that followed, and their children, and their children's children. Somewhere in there, people figured out how to keep bees, and how to fire clay hot enough to hold water, and how to shape metal, and how to write, and how to tell time by the stars, and eventually, a very long time from any of the evenings we have visited tonight, how to build cities. None of that would have been possible, in the shape it eventually took, without the quiet mercy of a climate that decided, for reasons we still do not fully understand, to hold still for a while. There is something almost tender about that, when you sit with it in the dark. All of this, the reliability of your seasons, the predictability of your rains, the fact that you can lie here tonight in a warm room at a specific hour of a specific evening and expect tomorrow morning to arrive at more or less the same time it always has, all of this rests on the accumulated patience of an old, complicated planet finally settling into a rhythm that it did not have to settle into, and that it has now held without any real interruption, for longer than every written civilization put together. We do not, honestly, know how long that stability will continue. The people who study these things, the same careful scientists who read the ice cores and count the pollen and measure ratios of oxygen and beryllium in cylinders no wider than your wrist, will tell you, without embarrassment, that climate systems are stranger and more delicate than most of us tend to imagine. The Younger Dryas is, in its own way, their patient reminder of exactly that. A world in balance is not a world guaranteed. It is a world lent, gently, for as long as the underlying arrangement chooses to hold. But that is a different story, for a different night. Tonight, it is enough to notice, quietly, that we are living inside one of the calmer chapters this planet has ever offered. That the arrangement holding your night together, the wind at the window, the temperature of the room, the steady weight of the air above your city is, on the long geological scale, unusually kind. And that the people you have spent this evening with, from the mammoth-side plains to the family beside the hearth, to the small camp of last hunters keeping a fire lit through a cold, their grandchildren would not have to live inside those people are, in the most direct sense, the reason any of this stability had anyone patient enough to notice it when it finally arrived. Rest, if your body is asking for it. Nothing important is going to change while you are asleep tonight. The Holocene is holding, quietly, the way it has held for a very long time, and this story gently is about to give you back to it. Before we let this long night settle completely, though, there is one small, ordinary thing left worth naming, a thing you may have on your table tomorrow morning, without ever needing to know how it got there. Somewhere in the long chain of nights between the ones we visited tonight and the one you are lying inside of right now, something quiet and enormous happened. A pattern that began as one household's stubborn wager with a piece of thinning ground, save this seed, tend this row, return to this same patch tomorrow, spread, generation by patient generation, into a way of living so widespread that most of the world eventually forgot that anyone ever had to invent it. Tonight, if there is bread on your table, or on a shelf somewhere in the kitchen down the hall, or somewhere in the memory of what you ate today, that bread, in the most literal sense, begins on a hillside above a thinning spring 12,000 years ago, in the cold years of a world that had not asked to be cold. Someone knelt in dry ground and pressed a seed into it. They did not know they were beginning anything. They only knew that it was worth trying, one more time, to make the land keep them alive. That is the small, quiet inheritance you carry, whether or not you have ever thought about it. Not the whole civilization, not the languages, the cities, the long list of everything people would eventually go on to make. Just the seed, just the choice, made in a hard century by people whose names you will never know, to trust a piece of ground with the smallest possible promise, and to keep coming back to it, season after season, until that promise finally began to hold. Sit with that for a moment if you like, or don't. This is a night for whichever it is. The world froze 12,800 years ago, and then, after a very long time, it warmed again. The great herds who had shaped the grasslands reached the end of their journey. New herds, smaller and gentler, took their place. A family beside a thinning spring made a small, tentative wager with a patch of turned ground. A hilltop was raised into stone circles by hands that would never know their work would still be standing 11,000 years later. A group of hunters kept a fire alive through a cold their grandchildren would not have to live inside. And somewhere, quietly, the ocean's great heating system found its old rhythm, and the warmth came home. None of it happened for any particular reason. None of it was owed. It simply happened, one small, careful act at a time, across a stretch of centuries too long for any single person inside of it to see the shape of. You are the far end of that story, not the final chapter. There is no final chapter, and there will not be one for a very long while, but the current, living continuation of a line that runs, unbroken, all the way back to that hillside spring, and further still, to a mammoth crossing a golden valley, One warm evening, 14,700 years ago, you are here because they were there. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. None of this is asked of you tonight. You do not need to hold any of it. The people in this story did what they did without knowing it would matter, and it mattered anyway. That is how most of the important things go. Somebody, somewhere, kneels in dry ground and presses a seed into it, without any promise that it will grow, and then, sometimes thousands of years later, it does. If your eyes have already closed, let them stay closed. If they haven't, let them close now, if they want to. The story is finishing. The fire, in every hearth we visited tonight, is banked low and holding. The child against the far wall is still asleep. The grandmother by the last campfire has finished her story, and the teenagers are already half dreaming. The family beside the thinning spring has covered the last furrow for the day. The hilltop with its great stone ring stands quiet under a moon that has watched it for 11,000 years. Everyone we spent time with tonight is, in their own way, at rest. So are you. Rest well. Good night.